class. Welcome to video lecture number 3 for Substance Abuse Fundamentals. I'm the professor for this class, Gemma and Andaya. So over the last 2 video lectures, I've asked for feedback in terms of what topics might be useful for you to know and for me to speak on. I think one of the major themes I saw in that feedback was that there's a desire to know what causes addiction. So that's a kind of a complicated answer, but we're going to try to tackle it during this video lecture. So there's a few biological, social culture, psychological factors that contribute to the likelihood that somebody will abuse and then become addicted to substances or even behaviors, right? I'll start with the most prominent of these factors, the one that I think carries the most weight, and the more I do this work, the more I start to see the truth in this factor. So there's a pretty well-known famous study from the 1990s, or it might be late 1980s, conducted by the Center for Disease Control in the United States in conjunction with Kaiser Permanente, which is a medical facility. So they took a survey of about 17,000, so it's a major study, about 17,000 patients, and measured different types of traumatic childhood adverse life events, and then measured how many behavioral or medical problems they had. So these adverse traumatic childhood events, they can be anything such as witnessing domestic violence in the home, growing up with substance abuse or addiction in the home, or growing up with mental illness in the home, untreated specifically, significant parental discord, crime in the home, being physically, sexually, psychologically abused or neglected. These are all experiences that could be traumatic for children. And so the survey then measured how many of these experiences the patients had, and then how many health problems and behavioral problems they had. And interestingly enough, the more adverse childhood events they had, the more chronic medical and behavioral health problems they had. So that there's a pretty big correlation there. There's another pretty famous study, and these are being in the comments box below the YouTube video. There's another pretty famous study that talks about the genetic predisposition of addiction and substance abuse. And so what these researchers did is they split up about, I think it was like 800 sets of twins, and then just measured them throughout life. And it turned out that if one twin had an addiction, 50% of the samples twins also develop an addiction, but then the other 50% did not. So what the study concluded is that there's a 50-50 split in terms of how much of addiction comes from genetic predisposition and how much comes from environmental stressors and those types of factors. So yes, so far we've covered adverse childhood events, so traumatic events contribute to addiction later on in life. A genetic predisposition contributes significantly, about 50%, to the likelihood of developing an addiction later on in life, and environmental stressors, such as sociocultural stressors. So what do those include? It could be low socioeconomic status, living in high crime areas, residential instability, the parents chronically being stressed due to low income status, the parents not being home because they're working to make ends meet. All of these factors, in conjunction with a genetic predisposition, in conjunction with traumatic events, increase the likelihood of somebody becoming addicted. And then there's two more factors I wanted to throw in there. So the next one is there's the latest research out there over the last, I would say 10, 12 years is starting to show that there's a somewhat of a correlation between traumatic brain injuries and then later on developing addiction. So traumatic brain injuries typically you can assess for it when you're doing an intake assessment as a counselor by asking, hey, have you ever been knocked unconscious after hitting your head? And that's typically a sign that, and then you assess how many times this has happened. And so traumatic brain injury, to simplify it the best way I can, is you are damaging the parts of the brain that are responsible for reason and logic and thinking about the consequences. So essentially, the stop switch of the brain is damaged, typically through traumatic brain injury. Sometimes it's the spine and, the brainstem, but just generally speaking. And so if that part of the brain is damaged, the stop switch, then it makes sense why someone with a TBI might be more prone to addiction. And some of the research out there is starting to say that the numbers are underrepresented as far as how much of the population has TBI. And it makes sense, right? Because if you think about the sports that are promoted and rewarded in our society, such as high contact sports, boxing, football, even soccer, can cause blows to the head or the frontal lobe and cause TBIs. As far as, getting into fights frequently as a child or adolescent, those can lead to TBIs. Okay, and then the final factor that I have for you in terms of what can increase the likelihood of becoming addicted is a psychological factor. So the inability to tolerate stress or uncomfortable emotions. So I often explain this to my clients that, being in this body, on this plane, in this human earth, comes with a full range of emotions. Everything from one end of the spectrum of anger and hatred and resentful and jealousy, which we don't like those emotions, they're uncomfortable, to the other end of the spectrum of joy, happiness, attachment, love, right? So everything in between is part of the experience. If we negate having these uncomfortable emotions, then naturally we're also negating having the really joyful experiences also. So in order to be open to these, we have to be open to these experiences. But I have seen a theme in my clients that, they have an inability to tolerate those uncomfortable emotions, and so they'll shut them down and shut them down and shut them down, and it keeps building and building, and eventually it blows up. They've developed all these maladaptive ways of coping with those emotions, not just substance abuse, but sometimes that turns into other risky behaviors such as sex or adrenaline rushes or running away or shutting down and hiding. There's all these different ways that we avoid having to feel these uncomfortable emotions. So part of the treatment is not only educating them on what's going on in the brain, how much time the brain and body needs to heal, but on increasing healthy coping skills and increasing tolerance to distressful states, distressful emotions. And I think that's what's going to lead me into the next lecture. If we have time before the end of the semester, I would definitely like to cover mindfulness with you. As you've probably already known from my introduction of myself in the beginning of the course and just little tits and bits I've dropped throughout the video lectures, my approach is very mindfulness based, and so I would love to leave you with that piece of how mindfulness training for your clients can help them better cope with uncomfortable emotions, triggers, urges, cravings, in terms of making their recovery process not just a white knuckling experience, like I just gotta stay sober, but softening and opening up to the world experience. All right, well, that's all I have for you. This is a short one, and best of luck in the rest of the semester, and I hope I see you soon.